Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's workshop. Our lecturer today is Anh Cao. She is a successful debater and a returning member of Team USA at World Championships. She was the best female debater at WSDC in 2019, and today she's here to talk to you about weighing and third speeches. So now I'm going to give the floor to her.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, as was said, my name is An. I was a debater. I recently graduated, did world schools for a minute. Today we're going to be talking about more like advanced thirds. And I want today's discussion to be, sort of informal, like as much participation as y'all want. So if you feel comfortable, if you can, it'd be great if you can turn on your cameras. If not, that's fine too. We're just going to be jumping straight into it. Great. Let me pull up the really quick. Okay, cool. So today we're going to be talking, as I said before, we're going to be talking about thirds. Can anyone tell me, like, what is, just in your opinion, what is the goal of the third speech?
To present the clashes in the debate and say why you won them or the most important ones.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely to present clashes in the round, explain to the judge why you win. What should a third speech involve? Like, what are the parts of a third speech besides just generally clashes? What else is required for a third?
It's basically just rebutting side oppositions or the other side's cases and then repairing all of your own arguments. And basically just if you establish like burdens of proof or whatever in a PM or an LO, then you just highlight the areas of debate which prove why you won.
Yeah, burden pushing, great in the three. Is there anything else that we should probably have in our threes besides like refutation, rebuilding? What else is necessary for a three?
If there are some clarifications that need to be made, you have to make them in third.
Yeah, for sure. Anything else?
Way off?
Yes, weighing I think is probably one of the most crucial elements of a three, especially like once you get past the level of, okay, I understand these three clashes and I understand that I have to refute and rebuild under each of them. It's really, really crucial that you weigh for the judge, weigh between arguments in the clash and weigh clashes against one another to let the judge know which is most important. Anything else? No? Okay, cool. I think that was pretty comprehensive, a pretty good summary of everything that should go into a third speech. So someone said earlier that the goal of the third speech is to use clashes to prove why you've won the round. I agree with that completely. I'm going to offer you guys like a definition of what I believe to be the goal of a third speech, just because it really helps orient how I view threes and how like I would go about giving a three. So in my opinion, the goal of a third speech is to select an argument or multiple arguments from your side, win that argument, so prove that your side, like prove that the argument occurs, prove that the impact happens, and then weigh that argument against all of the other arguments in the round. So you need to have something that wins you the round definitively. But then you also have a secondary burden as a three that is equally important, which is to provide refutation that shuts off your opponent's path to victory. So it is equally important that you prove to the judge why you've won the round, but you've also proved to the judge why you do not lose the round, why the other side could not possibly win the round after your three. I'm pretty firmly of the belief that that after your three, the judge should be ready to sign the ballot for your side. So you need to be able to articulate pretty simply why you've won the debate, what your strategy is, what your path to victory is. So given that we kind of understand the basis of the goal of the third speech and things that it will entail, we're going to be talking about three things today. First is just generally the structure of threes, because I think that the way that I think about threes is maybe a bit different from like what you hear whenever you're first learning threes about like have three clashes and do the refutation and stuff like that. And then we're going to be talking about issue prioritization. And then lastly, pretty briefly, we'll be talking about weighing, but the stuff about weighing will obviously be integrated throughout. Okay, cool. So first, in terms of structure, what is the structure of a three? Can anyone tell me, like, if I told you to like describe to me a three that you've given before, what did the three look like? What was the structure within the three?
Personally, I usually just start with maybe a short intro, maybe not. Then just rebutting every argument That is, if you're not doing extraneous rebuttal, and then just working extensively on repairing your own 3 arguments, and then just focusing on one particular argument, and then the way off.
Great. So you sort of do a strategy where you take like your side's material, or their side's material, you refute it, and then you rebuild your own material. Cool. Are there any alternative structures that you've used or that you've seen used open to anyone?
You can go by clashes.
Mhm.
I present the first, second, and then the third clash, and also a little bit of intro and outro.
Great. And how do you like order the clashes? Is there any special order to the clashes, or is it just like whatever you feel in the moment about like what most logically makes sense? How would you organize clashes?
The principal is the first one usually, and then like chronologically how the debate went on, and this is also how you present the second and the third clash, I think.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that sounds good to me. Any other alternative structures of the 3? I think that's pretty comprehensive.
Maybe the importance.
Mhm.
Like the most important, then the second most important, and the third most important.
And how do you determine what to you makes something most important?
I would say something that is related to our values. Let's say minority, which is endangered, over a majority, which is privileged. So then our value would be to help minorities. So that would be the most important clash in our case.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So the goal of today is to get y'all to start thinking about the way that you present your 3s in terms of getting the ultimate goal achieved, i.e., think of your 3s in terms of how you're going to win the ballot. So you want to make sure that whenever you're selecting your clashes, whenever you're picking the order of your clashes, you're doing it so very deliberately and asking yourself, okay, which clash, first of all, is most likely to win me the debate? And then is there an argument I'm going to for sure lose the debate on? Okay, if that's the case, then I obviously need to prioritize it in some way or another. So we'll talk about that more in a bit, but generally the structure of the 3, as I see it, is a bit different from what I think is the traditional structure, which is just like we will have 3 clashes, perhaps, or 2 clashes, 3 clashes, perhaps it will go principle then practical. The way that I see 3s a bit more is to pick the first clash generally is an argument, one of our arguments that I think this is an argument that will win us the round, or this is just the central focus of the clash. Obviously, it can include other arguments. Make sure it's an argument that you can like feasibly win the round off of, and we'll talk about how to know whether or not that's the case a bit more later. But after you do that, you make the argument, you extend the argument, you say, my partner told you this in first or second or whatever, and then you win the argument. So then you explain, you respond to the other team's reactions and you explain why those reactions do not apply. And then you weigh the argument. So you explain why is this argument so much more important than the other relevant arguments in the round. At this point, it's really important, since in this first clash, you're focusing more so on one of your arguments and explaining why this argument is sufficient to win you the round, irrespective of all the other arguments. Whenever you're weighing it, you want the focus of the clash not necessarily to just be explaining why the other side's best material isn't true. There will be a time for that later in the 3, but rather you want to pretend that their best material is true and then outweigh it regardless. And the reason why you want to do this is because if you spend the first 2 to 3 minutes of your 3 on a first clash, wherein you win an argument, you prove that you win an argument, you weigh the argument, you convince the judge that the argument is sufficient to win you the round against all of the other good arguments from the other side, assuming that they're true, then obviously like you win the round outright if you prove that there's a reason why you win, assuming that most everything else in the round is true. And then for the second and third clashes, like if you have like second or third clashes, generally like you can use whatever internal structure you're used to. Something I see a lot is like our material and then their material under the clash, and then weigh, which is something that like someone said earlier. I do think it's quite important though within your 3s to try to adhere to a clash structure instead of like maybe jumping around from argument to argument or going more so their case, our case, because whenever judges are listening to third speeches, it's really, really late in the round, right? they already have an idea of what are the issues that they're going to be voting on. They sort of have their own intuitions about what the clashes in the round are. And if judges are making their decisions based off of what the clashes in the round are, then your third speech also reflect that, because if your goal is to like win their ballot, it helps to put it in language that they're also understanding the round in, which is why we should probably use clashes in our threes, if that was a question. So now that are there any questions on like this general structure before we get in more so how to like implement it? The first clash is probably just like, here's a reason, here's an argument that we've developed, here's a reason why this wins us the round, and here's why this outweighs all of the relevant competing claims from the other side. And then our second and third clashes are pretty much how we do them like normally, like their material, our material, and then weigh after that. Is this all clear? Are there any questions so far?
Isn't explicitly listing clashes in a third speech rather than a fourth speech going outside of your speaker role?
No, I don't think so. I'm not sure if like the WSDC rules for like listing clashes in threes, but I think it's pretty much a norm, at least in like most world schools debates to have clashes like within your three. I think I've not seen too many threes like at like a WSDC level where the structure of the three was not clashes or within themes. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, okay, cool. And then the second thing that we're going to talk about then is a question of issue prioritization. And this is where the bulk of the lecture is going to focus. Because if it is true that the goal of the third speech is to prove to the judge why you've won the round, but then also dispute all of the material that could end up losing you the round, then obviously it's quite important that you order those issues like correctly and in the most efficient strategic way. So someone referenced earlier that like oftentimes you can use a principled clash first. Sometimes this is a really good strategy. Can anyone explain to me why we might want to put a principled clash before any other practical questions?
Because principles give you the justification to do the practicals. Like if you win the principle, you have the moral high ground to do everything else that comes in your speech later.
Yeah, precisely. So I think a lot of times people think about principles as like a sort of like categorical imperative, which is to say, if the state like has the obligation to do the policy, then it doesn't really matter whether or not the policy has good or bad consequences or anything of that nature. Or like conversely, like if the state is unjustified in doing the policy, if this is like a breach of our rights, then obviously this is a thing that we must do. We'll get into this is like brings me to like the first thing I want to talk about in terms of issue prioritization, and how we end up picking the arguments, which is the idea of resistance and relevance. Is it true that like all of the time, if there's a principle in the round and if the principle is a clash within the three, do we always have to put it first?
No.
No. What would maybe be a reason why you wouldn't want to put the principle first in a three?
If it didn't have significant importance in the round with the impacts, and if it can be traded off with the practical arguments.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, this transitions us really nicely into this discussion of resistance and relevance. I'm not sure if anyone is like familiar with these terms. Has anyone heard of like these terms before, resistance versus relevance in issue prioritization? If so, chime in and tell me what it means, but otherwise okay, cool. So this is I'm pretty sure it's like an American debate format thing, but there are basically two competing factors that will let you know whether like how much access you have to an argument or whether or not you should prioritize that argument. So the first consideration is resistance. Resistance is just the idea that you it's just the idea of how much the other team has said like your argument is incorrect. It's about how much refutation the other team has put onto your argument. So an argument that is highly resisted, for example, is an argument that the other team spent 5 minutes refuting in the last speech. This is maybe a reason why you wouldn't want to put the principle first in a three, even if you think there is like it proves a categorical imperative, even if it were to come above the practical stuff. it would take too much if the other team spent 5 minutes refuting the argument in the last speech, or even like 3 minutes or like a substantial amount of time, then it's maybe not strategic for you to spend the top of your speech on the principle, because it would require so much time for you to prove why you win the argument in the first place. And if the goal is to like win arguments and then weigh them, i.e. like win an argument and then prove why that argument wins you the round, then if you take too much time to prove that you win the argument, that trades off with your ability to weigh it. So you want to pick an argument like first and foremost that you have solid access to, that is not resisted. The second consideration is relevance. And someone already alluded to this earlier, but relevance is just the idea of like, maybe how likely, plausible, true is the mechanism of our argument? Like how likely is the argument to occur? How much would the judge buy into it? Does this argument take out any of the crucial arguments from the other side? That would probably be a pretty relevant argument. How central or core is the argument to the motion? So the goal with like picking clashes for threes should sort of be a question of trading off this idea of resistance and relevance. So I'm gonna ask you guys some questions and tell me like whether or not you would put them at the top of your three, and if so, why? If not, why not? So let's pretend the motion is this house would ban Catholic orphanages from opposing gay adoption on religious grounds. I'll say it one more time. This house believes that this house would ban Catholic orphanages from opposing gay adoption on religious ground. I'm gonna like set up the debate for you a little bit. We're on opposition. Props arguments don't matter. We're not gonna talk about them right here. We have two arguments on opposition. Our first argument is a principled argument about the freedom of association, the idea that the state should not force private entities to do things that they don't want to do. In this case, the state should not force a religious private institution from like giving children to people they deem like not like people they do not want to give children to. It's the right of private entities to do what they want. The second argument is an argument about children, and we say that children growing up in these Catholic orphanages, if they are adopted when they're older, like they've probably internalized a lot of problematic ideologies and thinking from the orphanage itself, because like the orphanage would teach the children and stuff like that. And so this means that it would probably cause a lot of mental strife to the child after they were adopted. This is like a ridiculously like skewed motion, but it's fine for the purposes of this discussion. So those are like the op arguments, like just basic arguments. One argument about the principle, one argument about harming children. And then there's also a third op argument about here, I'll put it in the chat. Here. Sorry, someone asked if I could repeat the motion. I'm gonna put the motion in the chat for everyone. Okay, cool. So also just if you have questions at any time, just send them in the chat. You can private message them to me or send them to everyone and I can answer them then and there, or you can just unmute and ask them. So we also have a third argument on opposition. It's kind of wacky. The third opposition argument is somehow or another, this motion would lead to like nuclear war. It's a very long link chain. We won't get into it, but our argument is just that it will lead to nuclear war. So please could someone tell me why, using the idea of like resistance and relevance, we should not, okay, assuming that proposition spent 5 minutes refuting our principle in P2 or in O2, P2, and we are like O2 or O3 or whatever, or P3 actually, if prof spent 5 minutes of P3 refuting our principle and then completely dropped our nuclear war argument that our op2 spent a really long time on, what do we prioritize at the top of the three? Given those three arguments, which argument should we put at the top, given the ideas of resistance and relevance?
I would probably put the nuclear at the top, because first of all, you don't have to do a lot of work proving why it's true, because your second speaker already did that and you barely got any rebuttal on that. And then you can just spend a lot of time highlighting why that is so incredibly crucial and why it is debate winning.
Cool. So I think you've correctly identified that it is an argument that has no resistance. So given that it has no resistance, it's like very easy for you to extend. Does anyone have a different opinion about what argument we should put at the top?
Yes, we should put the second argument at the top.
Why is that?
Because the second argument seems to be far more relevant debate within the context, and it seems more plausible than a nuclear war, which is generally a far-fetched point that was not rebuttal. You don't need to focus on that as first clash, because anyways, there's nothing to talk about. More so than the principle, because the principle was heavily rebutted, and it can be addressed second, as well as probably because, at least to me, the principle seems like something that is weaker than a point that cares about the children, rather than something that cares about institutions that are obviously discriminatory towards a certain minority group. So it's far more logical for at least me to focus on the second argument here.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we ought prioritize the second argument if that were the debate that happened. So the reason why we probably shouldn't pick the first argument, even if we think that the principle sort of offers us this like the state would be completely unjustified in forcing us to do this. There was so much resistance to the argument. There was so much refutation to the argument that me as a third speaker, it would require too much of my time to rebuild in order to make the trade-off worth it. And remember, at the top of my speech, I'm trying to prove to the judge an argument as to why, like the first clash is trying to provide the judge a reasoning as to why we've won. Like ideally all clashes are, but particularly want the judge to know, like at least like 3 or 4 minutes into your speech, a reason why they could vote for you. And I'm not sure that I would be able to rebuild the argument successfully within that amount of time. I think it could take maybe 4 or 5 minutes before I proved that we won the argument. And that is probably too long to do. I probably won't choose the third argument because even though it has not been refuted at all, it is an argument that says that like Catholic orphanages lead to nuclear war. And I'm not quite sure that any judge would find that argument compelling or plausible. So we made the argument got dropped. That does not necessarily mean that we need to prioritize it in the 3, given that it is not a highly relevant argument. So we have like a relevant argument with a ton of resistance that we don't pick, and we have an irrelevant argument with no resistance that we also don't pick. Given that the second argument was like probably engaged with fine, but it is a pretty relevant argument as someone explained, that is probably the argument that I would prioritize. The goal here is to balance this idea of resistance and relevance, because you want to make sure that your speech is efficient. And so like you're not spending 4 or 5 minutes rebuilding an argument before you can weigh it. But you also want to make sure that the arguments you're selecting are relevant. Like sometimes you will have to spend that amount of time rebuilding a really, really important clash, but you don't necessarily need that to be at the very, very top of your speech. Okay, cool. The second way that I think it's helpful to go about thinking about picking a clash is personally like what I have employed in my 3s, and also like I've seen it employed in a ton of pretty successful 3s throughout my time debating. So ask yourself whenever you're going into the 3, and these are questions that you can ask yourself in prep too, like ask yourself, what is the strongest proper op argument? Do we have any material that undercuts that argument? And then if you do, like that's great, and you can use that at the top of your speech. So oftentimes you can manipulate arguments to prove, okay, we've made this argument, and actually this argument takes out all of proposition's relevant material. And I'm going to talk you through some examples, and hopefully that will become more clear. There are 2 sort of examples, and this will be like interactive, but keep in mind the goal is like, if we have an argument that takes out their best material or proves that like the harm that they identify is much, much worse on their side, or proves that they do not access the benefit they want, we should probably prioritize that at the top. So the motion is, let me send it in the chat. This is a WSCC motion from a couple of years ago. The motion is, this house would ban the practice of importing brides. Is everyone clear on sort of what the motion means? Do I need to like just PM me if like you'd prefer if I explain the motion, but basically just like if you guys are familiar with the idea of like mail order brides, that people will generally from developed countries will like go online, find a wife from a developing country, and then pay for her immigration fees to come into the country to live with them. But yeah, so this is the motion. We are pretending we're on opposition. Prop's arguments are as follows. The first prop argument is an idea about abuse. They say that these relationships are inherently coercive and inherently abusive, and they will always result in some level of physical, emotional abuse, because this is the nature of the people who go on these websites, or there's a really imbalanced power dynamic. And because this power dynamic is so imbalanced, we need to ban the industry entirely. They also have a second argument about how this is worse for the like so yeah, the first argument is about abuse. The second argument is an argument that is more principled about the idea of consent, the idea that you cannot consent into a marriage in this particular way for X, Y, and Z reasons, what have you. And then they have an argument about how like maybe this would be worse for the children who result from these marriages, whatever. Ops material is as follows. Remember that we're opposition. Ops first argument is the idea of like autonomy. And we say that women should be able to make their own decisions. These are consensual relationships where women know exactly what they're getting, not necessarily exactly what they're getting into, but women know definitely that they are entering into a relationship with a man and they are going to live with him in a new country. And they probably have chatted with him enough to like know sort of what's up, and they still decide this is a good decision for me. I want to move to this country. I want to be with this person. And so we should not take away the right of women to make these choices. That is bad. Women have the right to choose. A second op argument is the idea that women will lead materially better lives whenever they like move to a new country. This could look like immediate physical security. Perhaps their country of origin, it was not like secure. It looks like extraneous benefits like healthcare, food security, like materially comfortable lives for their children, whatever. And it also looks like you know, they could send remittances. This could benefit the home country, what have you. The third argument from opposition is an argument that says that if you ban a practice of immigration, that practice does not just disappear, it likely goes underground. And there are a whole host of reasons that women will continue attempting to migrate in proposition's world, and all of these alternatives are bad. The first one is that like they pay the legal fees themselves. So now whenever they go into a new country, they are saddled with debt. So if they were to be like in a poor situation, like if their husbands were to be theoretically abusive, this could actually make it worse because they would be saddled with debt and be even more unable to leave. The second thing is like they could result to like coyotes or like smugglers or human trafficking, which could have a whole host of negative impacts. But basically the argument is just that people will immigrate regardless, and it's better, like legal immigration is better than illegal immigration in terms of safety. So we are at opposition 3. Let's pretend that every argument had an equal level of like refutation, an equal level of resistance. If we're asking ourselves, does opposition have an argument that undercuts the best material on proposition? What do you guys think I would put at the top of an opposition 3?
Probably the third one, because it takes them at their absolute highest, because even if all their harms in the relationships are true, you prove that, you know, it's much worse if this goes illegal, and there will be even more harms and danger and that kind of stuff.
Right, precisely. So like obviously opposition will try to prove that these relationships are not abusive. Like that's not something that opposition is just going to concede. However, our third argument proves even if the relationships are abusive in 100% of cases, it is much worse in a world where you force these women to illegally migrate, because then they don't have like the protections of the state. They couldn't like seek asylum for the abuse because they immigrated illegally, stuff like that. So yeah, I think that's the correct argument that you'd put at the top. Okay, now we have a second little example. Try to explain it like more briefly. I feel as though that last one took a lot of build up. Okay, cool. So the motion is this House would abolish permanent membership in the UN Security Council. Is everyone familiar with the idea of like permanent membership in the UN Security Council? Private message me if like you'd like me to like explain it very briefly. No? Okay, cool. So there are like 5 members of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. They have veto power. It's like France, UK, Russia, US, and China. And yeah. 1 second. UN Security Council. Just sending the motion text in the chat. Okay, great. So yeah, this House would abolish permanent membership in the UN Security Council. Proposition's argument is now we can invade slash like, okay, so the proposition's argument is like right now certain countries are blocking like humanitarian aid and peacekeeping missions to countries where we desperately need to send them. And so in our world, we're able to send peacekeeping and humanitarian aid missions to like Hong Kong, for example, Crimea, what have you. Opposition's arguments are twofold. The first argument is that like permanent membership is a good thing because checks and balances are good and like we should be able to have veto power. It's there for a reason, what have you. The second argument is an argument about funding. They say that if you take out permanent membership, you're guaranteed that the US, China, everyone loses interest in the Security Council and they pull their funding from the UNSC. And that's a bad thing because you need funding to send humanitarian aid. The third argument from opposition is the idea that countries are vetoing these policies or these humanitarian aid missions and peacekeeping missions for a reason. That if you go against their wishes and like do not allow their vetoes to happen, these countries will get very, very angry and respond by like fighting back. So this aggravates Russia and China into sending, like if you send peacekeepers into Hong Kong, for example, this would prompt a huge military crackdown, which would be worse for the people in Hong Kong. What argument should we prioritize at the top of the 3? And why?
Third one again, because it takes proper best, saying that even though they have the principal right to, like there's a principal justification that they're not going to be some 5 members that are there permanently, the situation is going to be worse and harms to those countries are going to be done on a much larger degree. That's why we prioritize the third one. Yeah,
precisely. I think that's like exactly correct. Also prioritize the third argument in this scenario because it proves that more people, the people that proposition wants to help the most, are actually hurt much worse whenever you send peacekeepers and humanitarian aid into these areas. I think that the way that I think about it is it may seem difficult, but whenever you're articulating this in the 3, like you make the argument, you win the argument, and then the way that you articulate how this argument wins you the round is you can explain, like, ask yourself, what is the goal of proposition? Is it to decrease abuse against women or coercion against women? Is it to improve human rights in areas that we currently can't go to? And then ask yourself, what arguments do we have that prove that proposition cannot actually access their goal or that they make it much worse? So in this case, I would say I would make the argument about how we have worse responses from Russia and China whenever we do this policy. And then I would say the goal of proposition is to secure like better lives for people in Hong Kong and Crimea, or to decrease conflict within these areas. They actually do not achieve their goal and make it much, much worse because they force Russia and China to respond really aggressively in these scenarios, which means that they have a greater need to send humanitarian aid and assistance in the future, which is quite bad, which like counteracts the goal of the proposition. So you want to make sure that if you can explain why like proposition makes the goal that they attempt to achieve much worse, it seems as though it's quite easy for you to win the round then, because obviously, like if proposition identifies a goal that they have and then they can't achieve it, and in fact they make it worse, then it sort of seems as though the judge wants to default to your side and wants to select that. Are there any questions so far about how we would pick an argument that we were to put at the top of a speech, or any questions about why we should even like put that argument at the top of the speech? No, none so far. Okay, cool. So I just wanted to quickly explain like the justification behind why we should prioritize like one of these clashes and put it at the top. Very briefly, just so that way like I'm not just like telling you guys to do something, it's like you understand the logic behind it. So why do we have to prioritize an argument in this way? Thirds are like really late in the round, and the judge is at every point in the debate, starting from like 01, evaluating what team is winning and losing the round, because that's their job, right? Judges generally form some opinion as to who is winning or losing the round by 02. Not to say that they make their decision, but like they are generally keeping up with the round and they see how it's going. They're evaluating constantly who is winning and losing. Given that you cannot present a ton of new material in the 3, the order that you present the material in can sway a ballot super dramatically. And the reason why this is true is like you can put yourself in the judge's shoes. Let's pretend that like any given round is really close. But you see a clear way for Proposition 3 to make the round not close, for Proposition 3 to win the round for Proposition. Proposition 3's speech, they spend 5 minutes like refuting, like doing defense, taking care of the other side's arguments, refuting the other side's arguments, which are the most important, the most damaging, which is something that 3s like will always have to do. They prove that proposition's benefits will not materialize, and that's what they spend the first 5 minutes of their speech on. And then at the bottom of the speech, they spend 3 minutes like making, implicating, and weighing the argument that would win them the round. Like telling the judge, here's our strategy, here's the argument that definitively wins us the round. You're sort of like doing yourself, that third speaker is doing themselves a disservice by saving it to the last minute, because the judge is spending the first 5 minutes of their speech like probably just like waiting for the argument that they thought like could win Proposition 3 the round. So if you were to like invert the structure, not change any of the content at all, but if you were to spend the first 3 minutes of your speech making the round winning argument, and then 5 minutes of your speech on that like defense, explaining like why the other side does not achieve their benefits, nothing has changed within the content of your speech. But from the very get-go of the speech, the judge knows a reason as to why you win the round, and then they kind of like not necessarily listen harder, but this sort of like frames all of the other material in your speech. So it's like at the top of your speech you prove that you win the round, and then everything else that you're doing in terms of like the defense is not even necessary to get the ballot, but you're still doing it and you're still proving why the other side couldn't get their benefits even if they tried. Whereas like the opposite structure is you're doing something that is necessary but insufficient to win, i.e. proving why the other side doesn't get their material before you're explaining why you've like definitively won the round. Does this make sense to everyone? Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, so basically it would be okay to just drop rebuttal on one argument as long as you spent like 1 or 2 sentences explaining why this isn't relevant enough or whatever.
So like another team's arguments, like the other team's arguments, are you asking if it would be okay to like drop one of their arguments if you explain why it's not relevant?
Yeah, just not rebut one of their arguments if you explain why it's not relevant. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like it's always helpful if the argument is truly irrelevant to the round and you're able to explain that in 1 or 2 sentences. Like if the argument is like this will lead to nuclear war, like obviously that argument is not relevant, but it still would be helpful if I had like a 1-sentence explanation as to why like the Catholic orphanages do not actually lead to nuclear war. So I think in those instances it is like ideal to have one response that explains why the argument is completely illogical and why the argument does not happen, and then that sort of like explains like why the only way to explain why an argument is super irrelevant is to like prove that it doesn't happen or that the impacts are inconsequential. So you need to do one of those 2 things. So either prove that the argument doesn't happen or prove that the impacts are inconsequential, and that's like sort of how we would determine relevance. So just like make one of those 2 responses to the judge. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Are there any other questions at this point? No, none yet. Okay, cool. Awesome. So now we've learned so far like the general structure. We should have one clash that sort of explains to the judge a clear reason why we win. Ideally, this clash ideally we have an argument under this clash which undercuts all of the other side's best material, using the examples of like the bride importing example or the UNSC example. Or if we don't know how to do that, or if that's not a clear thing that we can do, you can use the ideas of resistance versus relevance to select a clash and then explain why that clash outweighs the other clashes. Now we're going to explain how you like put it all together and take it from like the structure and the issue prioritization, and then taking that to like actually winning the round, i.e. doing the weighing, which is necessary to win. So can anyone just like, let's just like popcorn out like a ton of different ways that maybe we could like weigh an argument. What are all the different ways we can weigh an argument?
We can explain like why one argument short circuits the other team's argument.
What do you mean by short circuits?
That because our impact happens, it means that their impact could never happen.
Yeah. What else?
Maybe just prove why your arguments outweigh the other one. So for example, you could prove why the impacts that they have on worker populations is less than your impacts on the climate, for example.
Yeah, what else?
Why your stakeholders are more important than others. Like, for example, why you benefit marginalized groups and they just benefit privileged people.
Yeah, for sure. Why certain stakeholders are more important if the benefits are equal. Great. What else?
Maybe comparison with the magnitude, what affects more people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Hold on, I'm pulling up an example sheet with a ton of weighing on it, and we will look at that. Okay, sorry, 1 second. Okay, cool. Yeah, so those are all good instances of weighing, the idea of short circuiting, the idea of weighing stakeholders, weighing magnitude of impacts. That's great. What are the different parts of an argument that we can weigh? There are two that come to mind. Impacts. What's the other one?
The links, like how likely the links are to be true or to happen.
Yeah, the links, the mechanisms. I think what is super useful for threes that I don't see nearly enough is mechanism weighing. And what I mean by that is just explaining why one mechanism is better whenever compared directly to another mechanism. And what I see a lot in twos and in threes is both sides will have like one mechanism to get to, both sides will have a mechanism to get to the same impact, right? So we will say, both sides, we decrease poverty because like one side maybe like has a government program and the other side maybe like invests in like local businesses or whatever, and that alleviates poverty. But what in like generally what happens then is debaters will say their mechanism, or okay, so maybe some younger debaters might, or less experienced debaters might say, they say that they fix poverty, but we say that we fix poverty, and here's our method for fixing poverty. Maybe a more experienced debater might say their mechanism for fixing poverty will not work. Our mechanism for fixing poverty is this, and it will work. And like they responded to our mechanism by saying this, but that's not true, whatever. So you're refuting their mechanism and extending your mechanism. I think the ideal way to do, and like you should still be doing that sort of thing in a three, but it is really, really helpful for a judge if you're able to explain, they have this mechanism, we have this mechanism, let's compare which is actually stronger. Because at the end of the day, if the judge is evaluating like which side accesses a particular impact, if both sides are going for the same impact, they have to evaluate the mechanisms by which like both sides achieve that impact. And probably both sides will have refuted the other side's mechanism, right? And so if I'm judging around and I have like a lot of mechanisms from one side and a lot of mechanisms from another, and there are refutation to each of the mechanisms on both sides, and there's also like extension, like reactions to the refutation on both sides, then I sort of like just don't know what to evaluate. And I, as a judge, maybe I might like not intervene, but maybe I might say, actually, this mechanism I felt like had the least intuitive response, or this mechanism was just so intuitive that I think that even though it was responded to, since all of the other mechanisms were also responded to, it seems like the most plausible, and this is how I'm adjudicating this. You don't ever want to give the judge like that much leeway to do guesswork. You want to tell the judge, like, here's like, we have two mechanisms. Ours is stronger than theirs because, so ours is more probable than theirs because, and that way the judge has the direct comparison and not just like their stuff responses, like responses to responses, and like other mechanisms responses to responses. You're sort of like combining it. It's the same reason that we weigh impacts, but doing mechanism weighing is super important, and you can do that throughout the three. It doesn't have to be at the bottom of the three, but like whenever you're extending arguments, whenever you're comparing arguments between the two sides, explain why your mechanism is more likely. Why is it that that actor will have the incentives that you say they'll have? Why is it that that actor, like what incentives are more likely on each side? What is like, is Mark Zuckerberg more likely to respond to a government policy that like restricts Facebook's power by not like by backlashing against it and making Facebook more open? Is he likely to respond by just abiding by the regulations completely? Is he likely to respond by like subsidizing a new application that would sidestep the government regulations? And like these are all possible scenarios, but you need to explain to the judge, comparing the incentives, comparing the mechanisms, which one is more likely to occur, in order to ensure that the judge doesn't just like pick one for themselves, comparing like all of the mechanisms in the refutation in the round. Does anyone have questions on that so far?
If like down the bench, like both sides just like refuting the mechanisms, do you think that a three should then just be like, all right, let's say that both mechanisms work, even then ours are more effective because it's like shorter, or like it helps more people, or things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's just like, yeah, that's like mechanism weighing. Yeah, like you can just be like, there's also marginal differences in like the impact, and I think you can draw like attention to that. That would be great. So like a multi-layered mechanism weighing might look like, first, our mechanism is just more probable than their mechanism because XYZ. But second, even if both mechanisms occur, our mechanism is more effective than their mechanism because it takes less amount of time in order to go into place, or it like helps more people, like Diego was saying. Yeah. Okay, cool. So now that we've talked a bit about mechanism weighing, let's talk about impact weighing. What are different types of impact weighing that you guys have heard of? We've heard magnitude, we've heard short circuiting. What else is there?
Short-term versus long-term effects, like
yeah. Short-term versus long-term impacts, time frame. Yeah. What else is there?
Value.
Yeah.
Like the reversibility of an impact.
Reversibility, great. Yeah, so let's just like talk through this a bit. So weighing should always assume, weighing for impacts should always assume that both sides get access to their impacts. Like probability weighing is like what we use for mechanisms. Like you probably, whenever you're weighing impacts, like want to assume that both sides get access to their impact, and you want to assume the best case scenario for both sides. Or else sometimes your weighing isn't that charitable. Like if you've ever heard weighing that's like, okay, let's weigh and assume that both are true. Our impact is bigger, or it hurts more marginalized people, whereas theirs like doesn't really occur to the same extent. And like that is like a form of weighing, but it would be better if you were to compare like the best form of both arguments and say, here's why ours is still bigger than theirs, if it's the best form of both arguments. And the reason why you want to do that is because like you don't know what version of the argument the judge buys. You don't know like whether or not the judge is like really buying the other side's case, is being like super charitable with how they view the opposition or how they view the proposition. And so just to be safe, like you want to make sure that you're refuting the best version of the other side's case. That way, you know whether like that way, like you have dealt with like all levels of the debate, and you're not like straw manning their case or defeating a weaker version of the case. Okay, cool. So some different weighing mechanisms we can use. These aren't necessarily like terms that you need to use in round, but just like they're helpful for understanding the different mechanisms. So someone said like magnitude. This happens in terms of like breadth and depth. So magnitude in terms of depth would say like like if two people are hurt, one person is hurt much worse than the other person. Magnitude in terms of like breadth or like scope is just like if like on one side one person is hurt, on the other side like 10 people are hurt the same amount. Then you have like, you can have like time frame weighing, which is like you can say like in the short term this and this happens, but the other impacts are much more long term. You can say like on someone mentioned reversibility, the idea that one harm, maybe like death, is irreversible, whereas another harm such as like imprisonment is surely reversible. And then you can have, and then I have some like other weighing mechanisms that I don't quite have names for, but I think are helpful if you ever are able to implement them. So the way that I like wrote this down is like our harm happens quicker, which triggers their harm. Like we might call it like short circuiting. Like we definitely call it short circuiting. But let's like try to work through this together. So I don't know what the theoretical motion is, but let's say that we're like, this is like 2019, and one side makes an argument that says that if this policy happens, Trump will surely win re-election, and that's a really, really bad thing. Or like we'll say this is 2020, like Trump will win re-election, that's a bad thing. Opposition makes an argument that says if this policy doesn't happen, COVID will get worse, and that's a really bad thing. How would I explain that if I'm on the side that made the argument about COVID, how would I explain, or if I'm the side that made the argument about Trump, how would I explain that my impact, if it happens, actually leads to their impact?
Because Trump thinks that COVID is fake, so it makes the pandemic worse because there's like less regulation by the government and stuff.
Yeah, so you can just say like our harm, which our harm happens first, and that actually triggers their harms. So you should just defer to the world where like only one of those harms occurs. So if Trump wins, obviously COVID in the US gets worse. And so their impacts happen on both sides, whereas our impact doesn't have to happen on theirs. Another way that you can weigh is that you can use principles as weighing mechanisms. And I don't think that I see this enough, but it's just the idea that like, maybe you have a principled argument about like the obligation of the government. And maybe you have an argument about why this policy would lead to discrimination in some way or another. Maybe the principle is not particularly relevant to the debate. Maybe the principle has been torn to shreds by the other team and you don't feel like making a whole clash where you have to like build it back up and save it. It's just not worth your time. You can still use the principled logic of the first sub as a weighing mechanism for an argument about discrimination. You can say that given that we are reasonably certain that this policy will result in discrimination, the state would be unjustified in creating a policy that they know would have discriminatory impacts. That is an obvious harm that the state cannot do. Just as like an example of like how you would frame a principled argument around a practical argument. Yeah, pretty much those are like main ways to weigh. You can also make prerequisite weighing. Like you can say like our benefit is a pre, like in order to access their benefit, you have to access ours first. In order to, if the motion is like this house supports a global quarantine, and proposition makes an argument about like COVID ending, and opposition makes an argument about the right to mobility, how would we use prerequisite weighing, i.e. explaining ours is a prerequisite, our benefit is a prerequisite to accessing their benefit? How would we use prerequisite weighing if we are on proposition and trying to explain why the right to mobility is like doesn't matter or is like outweighed by our impact of like COVID ending? How would we use that there?
If COVID still exists, then you do not have the ability to be mobile because you are stuck at home, social distancing, all of that stuff. So to access the benefit of the right to mobility, you first have to end COVID.
Yeah, like to fully access the right to mobility, you have to end COVID. Another like argument that I think like is thrown around a lot maybe is like, in order to access all of your other rights, you have to be alive first. That is like the most like used version of like prerequisite weighing. So you can say like the right to life is a prerequisite to the right to mobility, and people lose their right to life if you do not quarantine or if you don't do a global quarantine. So we should just do a global quarantine. Okay, cool. Are there any questions so far about weighing, the different types of weighing that we've discussed? Great. So the way that you want to use this weighing is in your clashes, you can sprinkle this weighing throughout, like you can use it literally whenever you want, as much as you want. But generally, I see most people putting like weighing at the bottom of the clash, and that's really helpful for judges, because then you've like done all the work to win the clash, and you prove like why your side accesses the benefit, accesses the harm, and then you can explain like why like one is more important than the other, assuming that both benefits are equal. So like you've done the work to prove that you've won the clash, but even if you hadn't done that work, you still would win the round because you proved that the impacts are equal. The last thing that I want to talk about really, really briefly is weighing between clashes. So can someone explain to me like why we might want to weigh between clashes instead of just weighing within a clash?
Maybe because the opponent's team won a clash, or we won another clash, which is more important. So then we expose why us winning our clash is more important than them winning their clash.
Precisely, yeah. So like debates obviously have multiple components, and you never won like you probably in every round lose some arguments and win some arguments. You never want the decision of which arguments were more important made by the judges. So if you are going to lose a clash, if you definitely won a clash, you want to take the clash that you definitely won and prove why it's more important than all the other clashes, prove why it's sufficient to win you the round. And the way that you do that is it's just using all of the same weighing mechanisms you do whenever you're weighing impacts, or even whenever you're weighing mechanisms. You can say this clash is more important because we prove that it affects more people, or this clash is more important because accessing this particular benefit is a prerequisite to accessing all of the other like external benefits that pivots the discussion on and stuff of this nature. So you want to make sure that you also are weighing between clashes. And so you can do this like the way that I see it happening in threes is the idea that you can weigh between impacts, assuming that two arguments are true under a clash. But once you've definitively proven that you've won the clash, you can explain this clash wins us the round for two reasons. First, because it affects the most amount of people, and second, because it affects the most vulnerable people most deeply, which is what we care about the most, or the impact is irreversible, or whatever weighing mechanisms that you see in the moment happening. So yeah, does anyone have any questions so far? No? Lovely. Okay, cool. So just to review, there are like the highlights of this lecture in terms of how you should implement them in terms of your three is that the goal of the three is to make sure that you provide sufficient material that your team wins the round, and then also make sure that you take care of all of the material that you could lose the round off of. And the way that you do that is by selecting an argument or making a clash that focuses on one of the arguments that your team has made, that is able to prove that it undercuts the other side's best material, or is you're able to outweigh it over their material in some way or another. And then you also want to use the other clashes to make sure that you do enough work to prove that opposition does not A, get access to their best material, or B, even if they get access to their best material, it is inconsequential to the round because the other clashes are more important, or because like the other impacts are just more relevant to the debate. If there aren't any questions, that's it. That's all I have for you guys today on discussion of threes. I'll stick around for a few minutes if you have any questions I can answer privately. But yeah, I hope everyone has a good week, and thanks for coming.
One question. If the framing was just very, very crucial during the debate and there's a lot of time spent on that, should you include that in your third speech for like 3 minutes or something, or should you just completely focus on the weighing, etc.?
So what do you mean by, like, can you give me an example of like a debate where like the framing debate is particularly relevant? I think I'm not fully understanding.
I don't know, maybe if you had a debate in which one team said that workers is the most important stakeholder and the other team said that the climate is the most important stakeholder, and that just came back throughout the debate.
Yeah, so I think that this is like, I think they're pretty much the same thing, right? Like the idea of like framing stakeholders is the most important versus weighing stakeholders is the most important. They're not like actually like that different. So like all you would need to do is like prove that your stakeholder is more important, and you can do that like through weighing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. But no, y'all are free to go if you don't have any questions. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.